Hey guys, it's Wholesome Joe once again for maybe our last tutorial video? Probably not. So this is our next tutorial video in the series Arduino for Ghostbusters props. I think this is number 8 or 9, I can't remember. But either way, in this video, I'm going to go through the wiring process of transferring our Arduino project from our breadboard to our PCBs and finally getting it all into our Proton pack. Now, I will give you a little bit of a disclaimer starting out here in that since it's been such a long time since I did this, I kind of shot a lot of B-roll when I was doing the electronics and I was kind of trying to get my pack ready for an event. So I sort of didn't quite get everything, but I tried to do my best. At this point, if you've made it this far, that means you probably already have a pretty good idea of what you got to do. Basically at this point, it's just following the diagram and transferring everything that we did on our breadboard over to our PCB boards, and it's just soldering everything exactly like it was on the diagram. So if you just follow along with your diagram, follow along with what you had on your breadboards. I took videos of the way my breadboards were set up, and I took pictures of everything so that I saw exactly how everything was connected so that I could transfer that exactly over to my PCB board. So I'm not gonna show you every single thing that I solder. I'm not gonna go through every single little wire that I connect because it's all the same once you get down to it. Some of the other stuff you're gonna have to take some creative liberties for, as well as like do a little bit of trial and error, because it depends on what Proton pack shell you're using, what wand body you're using. I'm using the Q pack. At the time this video was shot, I was using, I think, the Mark 1 or Mark 2. We're all the way up to Mark 4 now, thanks to Quentin and Taco Belly at the 3D printed Ghostbusters props group. I highly recommend joining that group if you're not already. Those are probably the most accurate 3D printed Ghostbusters plans or files that currently exist. I don't think that's going to change for quite some time. They're always working on it. But if you can use any of the other shells, GB Fans, Ben of Kent, Max Factory, HasLab, I guess too, if you really wanted to change the electronics in it. But this is going to be kind of a hodgepodge of all of the footage I had for that, and I just do kind of a voiceover to kind of explain what I'm doing as we go, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. And let's get started. Okay, so we've got our PCB board here, and I've already got our Arduino Nano on the board, as well as our DF Player Mini. These are going to be exactly like they were on the breadboard. These are laid out exactly like the breadboard, and right now they're just I have the pins poking through the holes on the other side. Nothing is holding them in there except for friction, and what we're going to need to do is solder those on. As you can see, the breadboard, I'm showing you that the pins are exactly the same. They match exactly the same, so that all you got to do is put your components on the PCB just like they were on the breadboard, and you should be able to match this up and solder accordingly. So that's what I'm going to start doing here. I've already got my PCB here on this particular board, and you flip it over and you can see where the pins come through the other side, and this is the side that you have to solder on. So basically nothing is holding this here until you solder it to the other side, and that's also what makes the connection. So that's what creates the electrical connection. So once you connect all the wires, and I've also got my resistors already there. You can see, I'm trying to get it up close to the camera, the 2 resistors that we have to have. Same sort of idea there. I've already put those in and soldered those in because those were a little bit tricky, but it's the same general thing. You just put the pins through and solder those from the back side. We've been doing a lot of soldering already, so soldering should be super easy for you guys now at this point, and this is the point where you're going to be doing the most soldering, so get ready to do a lot of soldering. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back on and start soldering all of these pins. And you see, you got to take your time. Don't try to go too fast, because some of these pins are really close to each other, and it's really easy to get solder on a pin that you do not want solder to be on. And if you happen to get solder on more than one pin, which is very easy to do because of how closely the proximity is of the pins to each other, it is very easy to get solder on more than one pin. And if you do that, your circuit can short out and cause a lot of problems. So if you do that, you'll definitely want to try to remove that. Most soldering irons come with a little removal tool that you can use to remove the excess solder in the event that you do get solder on more than one pin. I've done it before, it's very easy to do. Now that you have all of the pins soldered, you should make sure to check all the connections, make sure they're all nice and solid, that you have a good solid solder. The solder should completely cover the little copper ring that is on each side or each pin. There's a little copper ring, and that's what kind of connects the solder together. And then once you've done that, make sure everything's connected, you can go on to the next one. So now I'm soldering the DF player mini to a completely separate PCB board, and the reason for that is because I just want to keep things tidy, and because once you start connecting everything together, you'll find that if you try to put too many components on each board, then it gets messy. Not to mention the fact that this is exactly how I did it with my breadboard, so that's also how I'm going to do it here. So now that we've got the DF player mini soldered, I'm going to clear everything out of the way, and now we have both of our components soldered to our PCBs, our Arduino Nano and our DF player mini. So now we're going to refer to this very high-tech diagram that I've created using a piece of paper and some colored pencils. Now I've drawn everything exactly how it is or how it was connected on my breadboard. That way I know exactly what wires connect to what. I've also color-coded the wires so that I can tell what is what. I'm not actually going to use all of the same colors for wires just because I don't have all of these colors, but for the sake of being able to tell what I'm doing and seeing what the different colors are, I am using different colors. You're free to use whatever colors you want. You can use whatever color wires you want, but typically power and ground are usually red and black and so on and so forth. But this helps me figure out exactly what I need to do, and I'm going to start with the easiest one first, which is going to be the power and the ground wires. So one thing to remember when you start cutting wires, especially when you start wiring to the PCB, since you're not just poking the wires in like you do with a breadboard, you only need a very, very small amount of wire in order to solder the wires to this PCB, because it's basically the same length as any of the pins, and you don't want to have a whole bunch of wire sticking out, so you only need like a very, very, very small. Just sort of do some tests, cut some and like twist it through. Sometimes I like to tin the end of the wire so that it'll go through the hole first, and then I'll proceed to solder it once I have it through, because sometimes those bare copper wires have a tendency to get stuck in the holes or just kind of get messy everywhere. And so if you tin them first, as long as you don't do it too much, you just got to make sure you're still able to push it through the hole on the other side, and then you do exactly the same thing. And you see I used a very, very short piece of wire, very, very short. That way there's not a lot of extra sag or extra wire hanging out. It's very, very clean and very, very neat, because you're going to have so many wires by the time you finish doing all this that you're going to want to have as short of wires as possible when you need them to be short. And for these power and ground wires, they definitely need to be short in this case. And there we have our power and our ground for this DF player. So moving on, I've already cut another piece of wire. We're getting kind of deep into the soldering now. As you can see here, I've already soldered a few more connections, and these particular connections have now connected our PCBs together. And that is exactly how they were wired on our breadboard. So we're just once again matching up our breadboard. One thing I will mention, and that's what I'm doing here in this particular shot, is I am cutting wire for the lights, but I'm not attaching the lights to the PCB yet. I'm just attaching leads to the PCB so that I can later solder the lights to these leads, so that way I don't have a large string of wires dangling from my PCB boards just yet, because that will just be super difficult to work with. So instead of just soldering the ends of the leads from the lights themselves that I had already wired up earlier in an earlier video, I have chosen to attach leads for those wires to be soldered later, and then I'll use some heat shrink tubing to secure that connection. Here we've got our thrower tip switch that is soldered into a sequence of lights. This one is kind of tricky to run through your wand, so I'll show you a diagram of how all of the lights are run through the wand. But I used I combined some ground wires, which is something that I think is probably good to do. Instead of having a ground wire for each of these components, I've combined them so there's a lot less wiring, and that's something I definitely recommend you do. Once you get familiar with how ground and power and things work, you can combine some of these connections so you have all of the wires that are ground wires for the wand lights. You can have all of those wires meet and then become a single wire, so you only have to connect that one ground wire. And as you can see here, I'm starting to wire up the toggle switches. A lot of people have asked me about how do I wire up the toggle switches. They're super simple to solder. Basically, you have your power on one of the connectors on the toggle switch, and then you have your ground on one of the either two poles, I think is what they're actually called, on the toggle switch. I'm not sure if it matters which side, because I didn't really pay much attention to that. I just put the I want to say the power wire on the middle one, and then I put the other one on the other side. It actually might be reversed, so I would definitely do a test, which is what I did. Do a test, just connect them and then flip the switches and make sure that they're working. But I really didn't go into specifics about which ones go to which, because you only have three. With this type of toggle switch, you only have three possible options, and you need to connect two wires. So you're gonna connect one to the middle pole and one to one of the two outside poles. And since it's on, I believe it's on, it's gonna change the circuit or complete or disconnect the circuit depending on which way you turn the toggle switch. So if you happen to wire it backwards, it's just a matter of twisting the toggle switch around so that it's not backwards. So really easy to solder these things up, and you're gonna have to do several of them. I like to, some of these I soldered after I ran the wires, so it will be easier to put the toggle switch in the thrower, and some of them I tried to solder while they were already in the thrower, but that didn't work very well. So I recommend soldering them before you put them in the thrower, because it's really difficult once they're inside the body. Now I'm using a little trick to secure my wires together so that I can run them through the wand a lot easier, because one of the most tricky parts of this is just organization, because you have to run a lot of wires through the wand. So basically what I did here was I took a piece of solid core wire and I used a little bit of electrical tape to connect that solid core wire to my bundle of wires that I need to run through the wand, which gives it just enough stiffness to be able to force it through the handle. And once I get it through the other side, then I can pull it. And as you can see, I have to do a good bit of finagling with these wires because they all have to go to different parts. And I'm basically running all of my wires through the wand first to their switches, and then I'm gonna cut, as I mentioned before, I'm gonna cut these wires so that I just have enough coming out of the handle of the wand, and then I'm going to connect the other ends of them after the fact. And then you could even use like a quick connect or some kind of Molex or whatever connector to connect them together, so you can make the wand removable if you wanted to. I didn't do that. It's just long bits of wire, and I didn't want to have to figure out how to measure exactly how long they needed to be. So basically I just cut the wires long enough so that they would come out of the handle of the wand, and then I soldered the ends of those wires to the ends of the other wires, and once again used heat shrink tubing to secure the connection. If you've never used heat shrink tubing before, all you need is a heat gun. You just wrap it around it and hit it. You can hit it with a lighter or a heat gun to make the heat shrink tubing collapse around your wires and create, a safe, secure connection. So I'm just routing these wires through the wand here, through the trigger box here. A couple of these are tricky. This is really hard to explain, and that's the reason why I'm just kind of showing you the video of me doing it, because it definitely took some trial and error to get this part right. And everyone might be using a different wand body than me that's configured differently, so you just have to sort of experiment with it and try to figure out exactly which way is best for you to route those wires. And here I am getting ready to solder another toggle switch that I just finished running the wires for. Like I said, I tend to run the wires first and then solder the switches after I've run the wire through the body. That way all I have to do is reseat the switch back in the proper hole for those switches, and that just makes it easier because there's not a lot of room in there once you start putting wires in there. And I really highly recommend, once you start putting wires into the wand, to use maybe some zip ties or something to keep them sort of organized, because especially if you're going to put a pop mechanism in later, which I'm using one in this particular build as well, and I definitely had some trouble keeping everything tidy and making sure that I had wires not in the way of my pop mechanism. Some people like to use hot glue to keep them secured. I like to be able to move them around, so I try to use as little hot glue as possible. Okay, so we got all of our lights in our wand, and here's our vent light, I believe, or front vent light. Some people like to glue that down in there. I've glued the ones that are in our hat lights in just with a little bit of hot glue. You don't want to use too much. Still got our pop mech functional. Make sure you don't block that if you're using one. I'm using Taco Bell's pop mechanism. I really highly recommend it. I highly recommend anything that Taco Bell produces. He does a lot of great work and has been a valuable asset to the Ghostbusters prop building community, so props go out to him. In fact, the pop mechanism that I'm using in this wand, which you see right here, is actually the pop mechanism that you'll see in the photos if you go to the Thingiverse for Taco Bell's pop mechanism. This is literally the pop mechanism that is in those pictures. He was very nice to gift it to me, so I'm using the actual pop mechanism that is on Thingiverse, which is kind of cool, but you can definitely print your own. I had to do a little bit of modifications to mine because I was using a different size tube for my wand than the stock pop mechanism that he provides. He does have several options for that, in case you're using the GB Fans tube or you're using like the Ben of Kent clear tube, whichever one that you have. In this case, I also had to switch my NeoPixel LED for the wand tip light to a single NeoPixel because the jewel just doesn't fit. I don't know how anyone has gotten that to work, even though that's what the instructions say to use in both Count Demonet's and Mike's plans. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe they weren't using a pop mechanism, but if you're using Taco Bell's pop mechanism, you're gonna probably have to make some alterations to what light you use. In this case, I didn't have to do anything to the code in order to make it work with one NeoPixel. I've looked into some other lights, and I think some other people have also found some other options that are a little bit brighter because you want that light to be really bright. I didn't really have any issues with the brightness of just this one NeoPixel, so that's what I used. You're free to use whatever you find works best. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm combining some of our ground wires so that I only have to connect one lead to our PCBs. So basically you can take all of the ground wires from every single one of the lights, or the switches rather, or whatever components you have that have ground wires, and you can take all of the ends of those wires, twist them together just like I'm doing here, and then you can solder those together and then solder the other end of those to a single wire, and then of course secure the connection with some heat shrink tubing or electrical tape, or you can also use liquid electrical tape. I've got some of that. It works pretty well to secure that connection, and then you only have one ground wire that you have to connect instead of 6, or or whatever the case is, and that makes it a lot easier. And once you start getting into trying to run all those wires, you're going to need to have as few wires as you possibly can, and I'm sure there's an easier way to do it than this. Okay, so now I've got everything doing sort of a test fit in the actual shell. Once again, this is the Q pack, and I don't have anything permanently mounted yet. This is just for me to determine the placement of where I'm going to mount my PCBs. There's a lot of space in this shell, so you could do this in several different ways if you wanted to. Some people like to mount this stuff to the motherboard. I like to mount it into the shell. I think the movie packs had the electronics mounted to the motherboard. Whichever way you want to do it is perfectly okay, because no one sees the inside of the pack anyway. But this was the most logical for me. That way I kept all my wires tidy, and as well as using the channels that are already built into the pack to sort of have some cable management. My audio amplifier, as you can see, I've got it wired up now, and it is going to be mounted above. I'll probably just use some Velcro or some double-sided tape or something like that to secure these. You can use some screws if you want to screw these down, because there should be enough plastic for you to screw down into it. There's a couple of models on Thingiverse to make a mount. I also did something extra for my audio amp, which is, if you're savvy enough, you'll be able to tell that I took the potentiometer from my audio board and disconnected it from the board because it was soldered to the board, and ran some wires to it so that I could put my potentiometer in my crank knob, so that I could turn the volume up and down with my crank knob. So a lot of people like to do that. I find that, I was going to put it in my wand, and then I thought about it a lot, and I realized that typically when I'm going to a convention or something, I usually don't have my wand. I usually have my wand holstered on the V-hook, so I don't usually have the wand out. And so in order to be able to change the volume, I would have to take the wand off, hold the wand, and so then it's stuck. Either I have to hang it from my belt, or someone else has to put it back for me because I can't put it back by myself. So it's easier for me to reach behind me and just turn the crank knob. But this is a completely unnecessary thing. You don't have to do this. I just wanted to because it was something else I wanted to try, and I think it's a really cool feature. And it wasn't that hard to do it's basically just soldering. We've been soldering this entire time. So it wasn't super difficult to do. So here is a look at the inside of my cyclotron. As you see, I've got my red lenses already hot glued in there. And I also 3D modeled these little reflector holder cup thingamajigs that I used to put the lights in, so that there's something to kind of hold them there, as well as I painted them silver so that they act as kind of reflector. And I also added an extra lens that I cut out these discs and spray painted them with Rust-Oleum frosted glass spray paint. so that it would diffuse the lights a little bit more, because if you don't put any kind of diffusion behind those red lenses and you put those NeoPixels up against those red lenses, you can see all of the individual LEDs, and I just don't like how that looks. So you want to use some diffusion. A lot of people like to use like tissue paper, or even just moving the lights further back. But in my case, I wanted to keep it simple, so I printed these little cups that I made, and I actually made notches in the cups so that the wires would have somewhere to be ran through. And then I just used little dabs of hot glue to hot glue those in place. Make sure you test the placement of where the lights are going to go, depending on which type of cyclotron you want to have, whether you want to have the normal rotation, or if you want to have the reversed. I think it's the Vinkman pack has the opposite rotation. It's either clockwise or counterclockwise. I can't remember. There's other videos about that. But there really isn't a wrong way to do it, because there's packs that have it both ways. So don't get too worried if you get it wrong. But if you want to make sure it goes in the right direction, make sure to test before you start gluing things. Luckily with hot glue, it's pretty easy to move if you need to. And once again, like I said, this is all up to personal preference, how you route all of these wires, just to try to keep it clean as possible. So now we're looking at the wand once again, and I'm going to start working on my bar graph. Now I will say this, I kind of got the order of these videos out of order a little bit, because I actually did the bar graph first. Before I started running all of those other wires, I actually did the bar graph first, and the reason for that is because I knew that I wouldn't have any space to get in there to do the bar graph if I started doing all those other wires first. So hopefully you watched this entire video to get to this point, so you can see that I did start with the bar graph first. I almost decided to re-edit it and put the bar graph at the beginning, but that's just the order in which I recorded the videos. So you can do it however you want, but I think it's a lot easier if you start with the bar graph, even though the bar graph is probably the hardest thing to get in there. As you can see, this is kind of a chunky piece of PCB that you have to fit in there. And here I am showing how I have all of the other wires routed through the wand. And this is probably the trickiest part of all of it, is just organizing your wiring and getting all the wires routed the way that they need to be. And the thing that helped me the most was looking at this diagram that I'm going to show you here, that literally shows how the wires route through the wand if you're going to use the pop mechanism. It's a little different if you aren't going to use the pop mechanism, but if you're going to use a pop mechanism, which I assume most of us are, you got to get a little bit creative with how you wire the lights, and you're going to have to ground the switch that's in the tip with one of the other wires, so that you only have a minimal amount of wires coming through. And here, because like I said, it's all about organization with the wires, because it can get really confusing because you have all these wires going everywhere. I used some tape, and I just made labels for every wire or set of wires so that I know what they are. Like this one is the pack on off switch, and I have one for each of the switches, so that I know what they do and I know where they go when I solder them back to the PCB boards. So this is something I definitely recommend you do. Maybe you can do it a different way. Maybe there's an easier way to do it, better way to do it. But since I did not have a lot of the same color wires and I had to reuse colors, the only way that I could keep track of everything was by labeling it. So that way I knew exactly what connects to what, and I did not get confused. So after this point, it's pretty much just connecting everything, soldering things up, and getting it all installed into the pack shell. Like I said, there's going to be some trial and error involved. Follow the diagram, follow all of the steps that up until this point. Like I said, I also believe that if you've gotten to this point, you've probably already gotten past this part, but I just wanted to show everyone kind of how I did it. As you can see, I'm not an expert, and I did a lot of trial and error myself, and that's the reason why these videos are kind of a modge podge of that, because I had to do different things and it wasn't an exact science for all of it. But hopefully this helps you. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below. I try to answer all the questions as quickly as I can. And if I don't know the answer to a question, I have a Facebook group that is dedicated to Arduino for Ghostbusters props called Arduino for Ghostbusters props. You can join that on Facebook. There's a lot of other people in there who are way more knowledgeable than me who can answer questions as well. There tends to be a lot of discussion about Arduino, and there's a lot of new code out there available now for you to try. And our next video will be probably a demonstration of everything in the pack once it's together. And then finally, when I find some more free time, I'm going to be starting on another pack, and I'm going to use that pack as the tutorial for the Afterlife rotating cyclotron light. A lot of people have asked for that. I'm sure there's other ways to do it now, other tutorials about it, but I said that I was going to do it, so I'm going to keep good on my promise to do that. So until next time, I hope to see you guys at a convention with your Arduino Proton packs, and feel free to share your builds, share your pictures and videos with me. I appreciate all the support. I did not think this was going to be as popular as it was when I started doing it. I'm glad it's helped some people, and keep busting.